All right, back with another project from Lizard Landscapes. Got a whole bunch of beach cubes. Whole bunch of beach ocean cubes. Some of them really small, super small here. Even made a triangle. And these are all living in my bathroom that has a beach ocean theme. So added this to the bathroom. Leave me a comment as to how you think this looks. But let's go ahead and get started. Usually I start off with doing a whole bunch of sketches, so got a variety of sizes and where the land in relation to like the ocean floor is going to be. But you want to wear one of these professional gas masks, help protect you from the dust. So I started this with this Post-it note. Took this Post-it note into my bathroom and made sure that the size was going to fit in the area that I was thinking. So using some XPS polystyrene and cutting those out just with a knife, but you can use a hot wire. So this, each of them are the same height as they are as far as their width. So trying to make like a true cube, but applying glue strategically. Just a one section because I know I'm going to have to drag a hot wire through this. So you don't want to drag a hot wire through dried glue. Much more difficult. And then holding these together with some pins to make sure that during the drying process of the glue that it stays secure. So doing the same thing with the triangle, applying glue only in that back part. You're just trying to apply enough glue to keep it together for the hot wire. So there they all are, a whole bunch of cubes. So I'm near an open window, near an open balcony door, and got the gas mask on, using hot wires from the hot wire foam factory, and basically just carving out a whole bunch of ocean floors. And some of them super small, just able to carve out that ocean floor with one swipe of the hot wire. And carving into the triangle. So tried to have some variations with where the ocean floor would stop. Maybe it's a little more deep in various cubes. So sanding the ocean floor, don't know that this was necessary, but because I was just going to cover up all of this ocean floor with random stuff like this. So carved out a little bit of rock and wound up using a little bit of like real rocks, but that's what this looks like. You want to be able to look down into the water and see, some variation and value. So creating some shadow, but this is how the triangle looks. And applying sometimes layers to get more of like a complex look. And then gluing on some like smaller rocks, small pebbles to kind of flesh out that styrofoam ocean floor rock that I've got. And then sometimes with some of the smaller ones, having a really basic look to it. But here's how I carved those styrofoam rock ledges, I guess. Just using your fingernail, sometimes a dull knife, but looking at reference photos, and really I'm just creating a whole bunch of vertical gouges or cuts and a whole bunch of horizontal cuts. So, and then throwing in the occasional diagonal cut as I'm doing there. But just trying to create some depth, trying to create like a asymmetrical look to this ocean floor. And then gluing on some of the little small pebbles. So some of them underneath the water line, and then with some of the cubes gluing on some that are above the water line. And then once I've got all that and it's all dried, using some straight out of the tube teal color, just trying to at this point cover up all of that purple pink styrofoam. So trying to get rid of all of that color, and then to try to create some depth, mixing in some black for the very bottom of that ocean floor to try to create depth. It should be getting darker as it gets deeper in water. Using more of like a true aqua in the center, and then of course at the top just using like a straight beige with white mixed in, and using acrylic. So because of using acrylic, had to use a spray bottle, like a fine mist spray bottle with water to try to make sure that the acrylic paint was staying wet. Because what I'm trying to do is blend all of these layers together to try to create this kind of seamless, almost monochromatic grayscale. So you're going from the very bottom, the super dark aqua to suggest the depth, and going up towards, there's that little spray bottle to keep the acrylic paint wet. And then more towards the middle is like a straight out of the tube teal. And then blending up towards that traditional sand color. So there they all are after I've painted the ocean floors. And another way of trying to get like a seamless blend between the values of the teal and even up into like the sand color is to dry brush. So in this case, I think I've got like the darker teal that has black mixed in, removing most of the paint on a paper towel and then dry brushing over one of the layers above it. So creating all of these barriers, you've got to create these barriers to go around all four sides and then the bottom of the cube to make sure that the resin stays where you want it. So just using like a thin cardboard and making sure that there's like this overlap, so probably a little bit more than a 1/4 inch. You want each of these barriers to overlap just so that you can have leverage later after the resin dries, so that you can pull these barriers off easily. And then using some plastic, this is like plastic you would get at an office supply store if you're turning in like a report for work or school. And then applying some glue, because you don't want the resin to be drying up against that thin cardboard. So this type of plastic works. Also used some packing tape for some of the smaller barriers. So here is that packing tape for some of the smaller cubes. I was able to have this fit perfectly on some of the barriers. So it worked with both, using both methods with that plastic that you would get at an office supply store or that packing tape. And then trying to cover up the rest of that purple pink color of the styrofoam, of the XPS foam. Just in this case with just using like a straight sand color, and then once that's dried, trying to suggest the layers of the earth. So just using earthy colors, using gray and brown and like a lighter beige. Then trying to dry brush in between some of the layers can give an interesting look to it. And using like a clay colored layer, throw some color in there. I ended up repeating that color in some of the rocks that are above the water line later. But then applying a layer of sealant. You don't want to have resin curing or drying up against like just a painted layer, so applying a good layer of sealant to every one of the ocean floors, and then finally gluing in like the bottom barrier, just in case resin were to be able to seep down into that ocean floor area, it would be contained by this bottom barrier. So I've got a whole bunch of weights and 2 of the barriers in place. Couldn't quite get all 4 barriers in place to be able to glue them. So I've got 2. Once those are kind of tightly up against the project, using glue to just glue them straight to the project. Then waiting for those to dry, and then getting the other 2 barriers in place, and then putting weights up against it, and of course applying glue to that. But you can see how it overlaps all of those layers to be able to later have that leverage of pulling it apart, or just taking a pair of pliers and getting more leverage that way. This is how the triangle was held together. And some of them, as far as like the smaller ones, didn't need weights to keep them in place. And be sure and watch this intermission. All right, time for another intermission. This is where I go completely off topic and try to motivate those who haven't found God yet to start searching. One thing I've noticed in the comments of my videos is some people are opposed to the idea of others, wherever they may be, sharing their faith. I can certainly relate, because when I was not a Christian, I, for whatever reason, didn't like it either. But I think it was because I didn't understand what was happening when someone witnesses. I didn't realize they were doing it because they cared about others. Now, some might say that this is not the platform for doing this, as in create a video just about this topic. But the question is, would you have found it? Would you have searched for this topic? I, for one, had to stumble upon Christianity, as in I didn't go searching for it. Essentially, sharing one's faith is kind of a tough love thing, because whether someone wants to admit it or not, we all kind of want other people to just tell us what we want to hear. But we can probably all think of a moment where someone told us something we didn't like at the time, but then later was thankful they told us. Remember when you were a kid, and I realize some listening are kids, but there were many times your parents told you something you didn't agree with at the time. And I realize not all people had a great upbringing and no parent is perfect. But for the most part, your parents were repeatedly trying to save you from yourself, telling you things you didn't like at the time. But usually people at some point, either in their 20s, 30s, or 40s, have that moment where they say to themselves, my parents were right. For me, it was many different moments where I was grumbling to myself, there's another thing that my parents were right about. One of my friends even wrote his dad a letter apologizing. It's that moment when you realize they were just caring about you. And it's basically the same thing going on when someone shares their faith with you. The point is, be careful of the people telling you what you want to hear, instead of the people telling you what you might not want to hear, but need to hear. Hopefully the takeaway from any of these messages is that this topic of God, eternity, heaven, and hell is worthy of your time. You do have a dog in the fight, as the old expression goes, and that dog is you and everything that makes up you. So one reason in which I believe the Bible to be true is it has more manuscripts than any other ancient document. And when you look at a comparison between the Bible and other ancient documents, it's not even close. So basically the criteria that a historian would look at or go by in order to determine an event's validity and thus mark it down as history is overflowing in evidence concerning the Bible. As I've said in other videos, does this prove that the Bible is true and accurate beyond a shadow of a doubt? No. But it's awfully compelling. I would think it would seriously make someone think and want to investigate the validity of the Bible. The point is really to motivate you to do your own research and ultimately realize that this topic is worthy of your time. Check out all of the amazing testimonies online of people whose lives have been transformed from following Jesus Christ. Please take the time to look into this. Thank you for listening. All right, so I've got all of these have been drying for like a week, and I'm going to do like a straight water test. So I've got paper towels underneath each project, just pouring in actual water, and only one of them, this one, had some issues as far as leaks. And so I ended up fixing that leak, did another test to make sure it didn't have any more leaks, and moving on to the process of pouring in resin. So I've got a certain type of resin. I'll have a materials list underneath, and it's a 1 part one bottle to 1 part the other bottle. So just combining those two bottles, and really mixed up just a super small amount for the first batch. Ended up doing, I believe, 3 separate pours. So you want to pour shallow if possible, just reduces the chance of the resin cracking. So I've mixed up a really small amount for this first layer, and then decided to apply whatever I was going to apply to each of the cubes in the triangle with a spoon, and then with like a popsicle stick. I thought it'd be easier to control than to try to pour from a cup into some of these super small projects. But it wound up kind of being a little bit of a mess. I mean, it worked, but it was a little bit sloppy. So those have been sitting for a good week as far as that really small amount of resin that I poured in. So I'm going to do another, it's not really a water test, but I'm pouring water in there to simulate the second pour. And I'm really just doing this to be able to know how much resin to measure for that second pour. So I'm not going to pour all the way to the top with this, but I need to be able to guess how many ounces am I mixing up, because the resin is expensive. Pouring that in, so then taking that, pouring all of these, as far as the water that went on top of the first layer of resin, into a measuring device, and then that gives me a good guess as to how much resin to mix up for the second batch. I don't know if that makes any sense. So here is that second batch, that second pour of resin going into all of the projects. You can kind of see with the resin having spilled over the triangle side, it was a little bit sloppy with this method of using a spoon. So here is the final pour. So again, repeated the process of pouring in water to be able to measure and get a good guess as to how much resin. And then pouring in this final pour that goes right up to the beach. And this type of resin, it doesn't find its level very well, so you really need to have a tool and go in there and help it to find its level. Otherwise, it'll just kind of dry bunched up like that. So this has been curing for a good week, and removing, or trying to remove, the barriers using a razor blade to kind of score that, and then using a pair of pliers to get leverage on that barrier and rip that off. And then sometimes with most of them, actually, you'll get this kind of coagulated bunching up of the resin in certain places. You just need to remove that, with a pair of scissors. Some of the projects, I was able to remove the barriers pretty easily. You can kind of see how the resin kind of crept up the sides of the barriers, and just needing to obviously remove those. And with the smallest one, sides or the barriers came off pretty easily, but you can see the resin really crept up the sides of those barriers. So here's the biggest cube in the series, really needing to use like all of my strength to get that thing off. So definitely benefited from there being that overlap of the barrier size. And then using a high gloss glue that I've used in so many projects in the past to create those ripples. So this really helps the projects to come alive, where that movement of the water really has an interesting effect. So trying to wiggle my brush to create that look of waves. And I found with each project, I had to apply at least 2 layers of this glue, and sometimes 3, for it to finally look right. Then once you've got the entire surface there of the top covered, like wiggling your brush back and forth to create those waves. Then here you can see with the largest cube that I'm trying to create this kind of arc. I found that it looked better with this kind of this arc shape to the waves that are going towards the beach area. And then, like I say, wiggling your brush back and forth to create that illusion of moving water. And there is how that looks after just one layer. You can already see kind of the suggestion of moving water, but definitely apply 2 layers, and then sometimes I had to apply a 3rd. Then painting some of the rocks that are above the water line and trying to just to create depth. Otherwise they wind up looking rather flat if you just have it one color. So adding some light gray to that already super dark gray, then adding a little bit of color, the same like clay color that I wound up using for like the layers of the earth. And then using a pen, as I've done in the past, where you dip this pen into acrylic white paint to create that kind of foam lapping up against the beach look. And also creating a whole bunch of dots to again suggest that foam that you see whenever you look at like beach photos. And then using an X-Acto knife to scrape away some of that white paint that I applied. Just creates more of a subtle look to some of those ripples. And then you can also just use an X-Acto knife to apply the foam that laps up against the beach. So here I've got this piece towards the bottom there that is propping up this cube, so that when I apply this rather thin sealant to just the beach part, it won't flow back into the water area. Because what I'm going to do is cover that beach part with this runny sealant and then sprinkle sand on it. So you don't want any sand obviously going into like where the water is. You just want it covering the beach. That's why I prop up. So this one, it's been propped up. I think this is the larger one, covering that area where you just want sand to be, and then sprinkling sand just on that part. And then once that is dry with each project, brushing away that loose sand. And then with each project, when you've got barriers that you've glued into place, usually when you remove them, there's a little bit of damage. And so just going back in with some of those same colors it took to create the layers of the earth, and doing a little bit of repair work. And then got some puke green faded twine that I'm going to try to create some beach weeds. So cut out some of those fibers and just using some normal glue to trap the base of those fibers. And then once that has glued, they're stuck together. And you can rip that off and then cut up that glue and gouge into the beach area to try to create an opening, and then apply some glue to that opening, and then install some beach weeds. So kind of fleshes out the look of the beach area, plus applies a little bit of color. And then as a last stage, using some of that same high gloss sealant or glue it took to create the ripples, I'm going to apply a really thin layer over top of all of that white acrylic paint, because that'll dry super dull. And to try to reestablish that wet look, I'm going to go over all of that white paint. And there you have it. Whole bunch of tiny beach cubes. And this is where they're living, like I said in the beginning, in my ocean beach themed bathroom. So be sure and check out the other videos on the channel. And as always, thank you for watching.